Hello. Well, it's great to be back with you to talk about our favourite topic of languages. And as usual, I'm going to go through the first part of this live, talking about the question that I asked and the responses that I got. And we'll just go through that, and then we'll have some time as well in the second half to answer any questions you may have. And I'm very happy to do that. So it's great to be back. Thank you for joining. And yeah, good to. Yeah, always good to sort of chat about languages. So I really enjoy this. The question today was about fluency and about do you feel that you're fluent? Sometimes when we learn a language, okay, we think of this thing of you keep going up and you get to a point where you're fluent, and there are lots of different discussions as to what that means. And I've seen many different things, and this is partly why I wanted to talk about it, because some of the things. Can you not hear me on Instagram, dear? Let me know if is that any better, dear? I hope that it's going to work, but okay. So if you when we talk about fluency, of course, I mean, last week I talked about an idea of fluency being this sort of this level where you can basically learn through the language, and you are able to use the language in a very easy way to be able to communicate on most topics, and also to learn through the language. And that's probably around sort of late B1, B2 stage of learning in terms of the CEFR levels. It's around about then that we become sort of, I guess, independent speakers of the language. And I think I'm going to take that as my sort of arbitrary or my own sort of idea as what fluency is when I talk about fluency generally. But the thing is, clearly, I mean, if you're at that level, there are going to be things that you don't know. And this comes up a lot. And some of the things that I see are, people say, well, if you can't, do you know how to say this word in a language? And if you don't know that word, then you're not fluent. Or if you can't describe this thing, then you're not fluent. Or you can't talk about that, then you're not fluent. And I'm not so big on these kind of subjective ideas from one or two individuals who think it's okay to judge based on like one thing. For example, I heard somebody say once, if you can't say, I can't remember what the word was now, but there was kind of I think it was shoelaces or something like that. If you don't know the word for shoelaces in a number of languages, then you don't speak the language. Well, honestly, you don't really talk about shoelaces that often, unless you're specifically having a conversation about shoes, in which case, if you are fluent in the language at this B1, B2 stage, you can ask what the word is and then start using it if it's really important to you. So this is where I make the difference between not knowing a word every now and again, and sometimes it might seem like a very basic word like shoelaces. And then sometimes actually that word may be basic in terms of, as somebody who grew up speaking that language, you learn the word shoelaces very quickly because you have to learn how to tie them. And so they're very much part of the sort of the day-to-day speech, and pretty much everyone who speaks English as the language that they learned first, or as one of the first languages they learned from a young age and went through school speaking English, it would be very unusual for them to not know the word shoelaces. Likewise, there would be other words that would also fit into that category. But when you come to a language later in life, even from your teens, the word shoelaces is actually quite rarely seen. It's a word that, yes, it's seen as a basic word that people would all know and understand and be able to use if they want to, if they've grown up speaking the language. But no, it's not an obvious word if you have been studying the language. Even if you've been studying it sort of quite intensively, it could be a word that's escaped you quite easily, in fact. And so I would never judge people's ability to use a language based on that. I would always say that actually it's more to do with the ability to then learn and then reuse and use the words and the language afterwards. So that's kind of where I fit in with this. And also, I mean, in terms of judging those kinds of levels as well, it's very difficult to judge a level of a language based on the ability to say one thing at one time. It's definitely more of a conversation. It's definitely more of a a more holistic approach to languages. Now, there are a couple of things that came out of me asking this question. Of, do you ever doubt your fluency? Do you feel that you're still not fluent in the language? And a couple of people said, it doesn't really matter. I don't really mind if I'm not fluent. I just enjoy the process of learning. And I think it's a really great way to be. If you feel that way, I think it's super, super positive. And I tend to be more on that side of my thinking. A number of people wrote and said that it was actually quite frustrating that you'd learn a language to quite a high level, and then you'd get to a position where you could speak to people who use the language on a daily basis. But then what would happen is those people would reply, particularly for English speakers, but also for other people who speak English, they'd reply in English. Now, that problem I've heard many, many times, and that action of speaking English has a few effects on English speakers. The first effect that it has is that it makes you feel that your language might not be as fluent as you thought it was. So they're using the English to make your life easier because they think maybe you don't speak the language well. Now, that's the first effect. The second effect is that it can make you feel a little bit frustrated and angry because you're there trying to speak the language and they're replying to you in English, and you're like, I can continue in the language, it's not a problem. I'm just going to talk through sort of my experience living in the Netherlands when I moved there, and tell you how I dealt with this. Because I think possibly my personal experience might be useful in this in this area. So when I moved to the Netherlands, I already spoke German. I already spoke basic Dutch. I mean, I could get by in Dutch, and so I could do all the normal things. I was probably around that B1-ish level in Dutch, where I could understand it pretty well. I could definitely learn things through Dutch. I could watch and sort of what was going on around me and interact with my environment quite easily when I moved there. And I went to live in Rotterdam. And what I found was the very first 6 months that I lived there, I would be using Dutch at work, for work anyway. I was working partly through Dutch as well as other languages. But what I'd get was, if I didn't know a word particularly, say I didn't know the word for, I don't know, I can't remember which words I asked for now, but if I didn't know a word, I would say, oh, hoe zeg je dat in het Engels? And then I'd point to whatever it was. And then what would happen, not all the time, but quite often, is that they would then realize that, okay, maybe my Dutch isn't good enough. So they would start speaking back in English after that happened. And I just looked at them and said, thank you so much for trying to make my life easier by speaking English. But you know what? I've moved to the Netherlands and I really, really love your language, and I want to speak it. And if you can help me by letting me practice, and if there's anything that I don't know, I'd love to hear from you and for you to tell me what that is so that I can learn and speak better. And I don't think I ever had a negative reaction from that. It was always very positive. They liked it. They spoke back to me in Dutch from then on, and they never spoke to me in English again. And my Dutch did improve. There was one other time where I went to buy a plane ticket, and I went in and I spoke in Dutch the whole time. And that was at a point where after that first 6 months, where I did have that gap in vocabulary, where I couldn't say everything I wanted to. But after that 6 months, there was only one occasion where I went in and spoke Dutch at to book a flight. It was in the days pre sort of internet flight bookings, so it shows how old I am and how long ago this was. But what happened was I did everything in Dutch. Talked about the flights, talked about the connections, talked about all the other stuff, gave all my details and everything. And then it came to, have you got your passport? And then I gave my passport, and obviously I have a UK passport. And the lady who was working there looked at my passport and said, "Oh, you're British." And then and I was like, "Yeah, yeah." And then she started speaking to me in English, and I just made a joke of it and said, "And since I gave you my passport, I haven't forgotten Dutch. I can still speak Dutch." And she sort of laughed and she said, "I'm really sorry. It's just when we see a passport from the US or Canada or the UK or somewhere like that, where we know they speak English, we just automatically switch to English, and it's something I don't even think about." And so I just said, "Oh no, it's fine. I mean, I get it." So, but she kept trying to go back to Dutch, which I thought was super cool. That's kind of one of the ways I do it if I'm in a longer discussion with someone, where I'm talking and having more of an interaction. What I do in shorter interactions is a little bit meaner. Um, I will sometimes tilt my head if they speak English, as though like, huh, sorry, what did you say? And I don't say anything. I just go, huh, and look confused. And then they kind of, the psychology sort of reverses back on them, and they they feel a little bit sort of self-conscious. So they go back to the language of the country where we are, and they start talking to me in that language instead. And I do get that, particularly where I look very different to the native inhabitants, particularly in Southern Europe. That will happen, because I clearly don't look Southern European, um, and well, not typically Southern European anyway. So that's kind of one of the things I do. Um, the other thing I have done, I tend never to get angry with people when they do this, because it's like I've sort of learned over the years that what they're trying to do is make my life easier, and it's coming from a good place, more often than not. And it's more about, sometimes it can be about them wanting to speak English. And I have had occasions where people have actually said, "Do you mind if I speak a bit of English? I really like it." And actually, when they've asked me that, I've been quite happy to speak English to people, in countries where I speak the language potentially a lot better than they speak English, because hey, why not? I mean, I know how it is to be desperate to speak the language with a native speaker, or someone, who we see as, a first language speaker of a language. And it can be quite difficult, So I kind of get that and have some empathy, particularly if I'm living in a place and for me, it's not really a big issue. I tend not to have that as a normal daily thing that I do with people, but I do in certain circumstances if someone's asked, and people have asked before, and I've been quite happy to do that. Given I don't speak English most of my day, it doesn't really matter to me if I speak English or not, because most of my day I'd say the vast majority is in Macedonian. So that's sort of a thing for me that I don't mind. When it gets to the other sort of thing that I might try as a trick, is kind of, I will sort of look at people and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and say in English, or I'll say this in English. They maybe speak to me in English instead of speaking in the normal language of the country, or one of the languages of the country. And I will look at them and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were from here and that you maybe knew the language. I'm happy to speak English if that's easier for you." And then you find also that there's this sort of psychological effect of, they revert back and they're like, "Oh no, I'm actually from here. I speak the language. It's my language." And then they feel this kind of pride of speaking their own language, and so they do go back to that language. I've done that a few times, and then every now and again someone will sort of say, "Oh well, oh, you speak a little bit of the language," and I say, "Well, particularly here in the Balkans," I say, "Well, I speak actually, I speak a number of the languages of this region. So if you speak another one, I'm happy to switch to that as well." So I've had those kinds of conversations quite a few times in my life, and I find that that's a really nice way to approach this, feeling of, do we, because we can feel sort of quite angry, I think. I've seen people, and I've heard from people that they feel angry when they get this English back, particularly. And I understand it. I think it's a valid emotion. I just try to turn it on its head a little bit, and have a think from the other person's point of view of what they're trying to do. Are they actually doing this to be malicious? 9 times out of 10, actually 9.9 times out of 10, they're not. They're just actually trying to help. and they think they're doing something good, or the thing that can happen, and this is when you're abroad, right? So because I've been living away from the United Kingdom for a long time, but if you're in your country where where you speak English typically as a main language, like if I'm back in the UK, or if if in the US or in Canada or wherever in the world you are, and actually the main language that's being spoken is the one being spoken back to you by somebody who is maybe not from there, but you recognize them as a speaker of a language you want to learn. This is where there's a bit of a we've got to play a game of etiquette. Okay, so I wouldn't expect somebody to come to my country who wants to speak and learn my language for me then to just speak over them in their language, if that makes sense. So this could happen in, for example, an environment as well in another country where English is the dominant language. You often get that in places where people work, in places of work, in multinational companies, where it might be, people speak different languages outside, but inside the office they speak English or maybe another language. And when that kind of thing happens, I tend to actually conform and say, okay, English. I may at some stage talk to them because they'll find out I like languages. I can't really hide it very, very well. And sometimes they ask me if I speak the language, and I will say yes. But I don't tend to, unless they sort of show an interest, I don't tend to expect them to speak to me in the language normally, if English is the common language or another language. So there is a kind of I have heard that people will say that they get cross because they'll be in a restaurant, for example, and it's a Korean restaurant or a Thai restaurant or an Indian restaurant, and they'll hear the people speaking a language from the country, and then they'll say, okay, well, let's just speak that language. I wouldn't necessarily do that myself. Kind of the limit might be is if I've heard them speaking the language and I know that they speak the language, I may say thank you in the language. I may greet somebody in the language if I hear them speaking it when I walk in. That's possibly as far as I'd go. To actually insist on speaking it with them and they speak to me, I'd feel a bit weird doing that, just because in English-speaking countries particularly, there's a social pressure to conform. So people who move to English-speaking countries and other countries, not just English-speaking, but I can speak about English-speaking countries because it's my domain, right? There is definitely social pressure to conform to linguistic norms, and often that's speaking English and being seen by people outside as speaking English, because it can make them feel socially awkward or socially a disadvantage, or being judged by other people who are not interested in languages like us. And so I tend not to do that unless it comes up again in conversation. I may ask questions about, if they speak any of the languages, if they speak any other languages. My common question would be not to say, do you speak this language? It would normally be, oh, I really love languages, and I particularly like whichever language it might be in that area. And then say, do you happen to speak any other languages as well? And then it leaves it open, because what I find is if you go to, say, for example, you might go to a Turkish restaurant and you may ask the question, speak Turkish, or, and think that that's their language because it's a Turkish restaurant. It could actually be that Kurdish is their first language, and actually they really like speaking Kurdish, but they're not that fussed on speaking Turkish because for them it was just another language that they learned, and they've moved to another country, so you never know what's gone on, sort of behind that. And so I tend to just ask it in that very neutral way of, do you happen to speak any other languages? Because I love languages, and if the context is right, I don't just do that randomly, sort of on the street. but if the conversation it goes around that way, then that's the kind of thing that I would do. And I find that people generally are actually quite nice. I've had many interesting conversations that way, and in terms of, I know this is kind of the fluency here was when people feel, I know that some of you have mentioned this, but when you feel that you are actually fluent in the language, but then you get the English back. That is kind of what I see as what happens, and that's what I would say is a good way to handle it. In terms of that feeling of fluency again, and where I would say there's an interesting thing that happens with language learning is you start learning a language, you obviously pick up more and more vocabulary and grammar to go with it, and you're able to start saying more and more things. There will inevitably always be vocabulary that you won't come across or learn or internalize for whatever reason. This is just a fact of life. This actually happens even if you're a monolingual and you speak one language, it happens too. This is a normal thing. I as an English speaker, actually have really learnt lots of new words, even as an adult, that I didn't know in English, because English is such a big language with a lot of vocabulary. Sometimes also there are words and phrases that you can't directly translate into another language you speak. So sometimes the concepts are slightly different. So the feeling behind a word might have a slightly different color to it in one language over another. And that could be because of the words it's related to in that language that give it a different feeling. It could be that simply it's used in a different way. So these kinds of things have their part to play as well. And I found that when I've gone to learn another language, particularly some of the languages I speak on a daily basis, if someone were to say to me, okay, what did you just say exactly now, word for word, in English? I would sometimes find that quite challenging to do, because there's not always an equivalent there. Sometimes there are even words that don't exist in other languages that are quite normal for one population and not for another. And there's a word, for example, in Macedonian, there's a word to describe a bright blue sky with the sun shining, and but it's very cold. and I know how to say that in Macedonian, but I would have no idea how to say that in English in one word. I don't know a word like that in any other language, in fact. I only know it in Macedonian. Also, there are words for, there are very common thing that you may hear are words for relationships as well. So like, I'll give my home language again, but there are Chinese is also full of these kinds of words, as are a number of other languages. So there'll be a word for the different types of brother-in-law, sister-in-law relationships. So, depending on whether it's two sisters or two brothers or whatever it is, there will be different words for brother-in-law. So my wife's brother is my shura, and I am his zet in Macedonian. And if my wife had a sister and her sister had a husband, he would be my bajanak. And these kinds of things, there's only one word in English, it's brother-in-law. Another thing in the Balkan culture, for example, you will see a word like godfather used in English as the translation for a role that isn't really that in these cultures. In fact, it's called kum and kumstvo. So the kumstvo, the kum is translated very very often as father, sort of godfather, but godfather in English is one role. In the culture here, that idea of kum, actually, traditionally speaking, some people lately have sort of altered it a little bit, but traditionally speaking, is kind of a mix between the best man role and the godfather role. It's kind of both of those roles fused in a way, and even a bit different to that as well. So sometimes, yeah, you'll hear a word, or you'll say something, or they'll have an idea, and you can sometimes have a feeling that oh, do I even speak my own language properly, because I can't express this? And the truth is if you can learn these concepts and you can learn these ideas, then you're pretty much fluent in the language. If you're able to truly learn this, I mean, I'm not talking about with somebody sort of sitting there with a stick and sort of explaining a concept for hours and hours. I'm talking about you can learn it in a normal sort of fashion with fluent, normal, fluid explanations around it, where people aren't sort of tapering the language too much to fit sort of a very low level in the language. I'm talking about sort of a normal conversation, right? Where you can learn. So yeah, I mean, these things stick out to me when I talk about fluency. Sometimes we do have those times where a word escapes us. And this is where I think that actually it's nothing to do with true fluency. This is actually more to do with psychological pressure that we put on ourselves. So it's interesting, I find, when if I can't think of a word in English or in a language I know very, very well, I know that it's because I don't know the word at that moment in time, and not it's because for some reason something's happened in my brain and I can't say the word, but I know that if I hear it, I'll know it. That for me does not impact me in sort of debating whether or not I'm fluent. And I know that that does do that for some people. And if it does that for you, just know that you're not a robot and that you can have sort of moments of sort of lack of clarity and lack of ability to just sort of produce something immediately on the spot. Sometimes it's just a physiological thing. Sometimes it can be other psychological reasons like social pressure, or you can be in a difficult situation, or you could have been speaking another language just before that, or you could have other things on your mind, or it could be many, many things. You could even just need to eat. And so, or you could be tired. It could be anything, right? But sometimes I think what happens is when it's our own language, when it's like a language that we know as sort of our first, on a first language level basis, we tend to understand that. But when it's with another language, we tend not to so much, and we sort of are very hard on ourselves. And I think that's something we just need to accept, acknowledge, and then sort of work through on our own, because just not knowing a word or making a mistake once doesn't mean that everything else is ruined and that it's no longer valid. If you've got that ability to be fluent in a language, it's sometimes you come back to it. Sometimes fluency and eloquency and ability to express yourselves are not on a plateau, not even in your first language. I find myself as well sometimes I'm struggling for words or to express myself adequately, even in English, as I would on other occasions, and that's completely normal. And so it is with other languages. Sometimes we just have off days. I mean, I will sometimes get things wrong in languages I know very well. It happens. So it's a lot of this is psychological, and a lot of it is to do with mindset and how we react and how we deal with the things that are going on. So, of course, when you're at this kind of this B1, B2 level, there's a wealth of vocabulary that you still maybe need to be exposed to. That takes time. So you're more likely to have these feelings as you're going through those stages, because you'll have days where, and maybe even weeks, where you feel like you're really flying with the language and you'll feel like, oh, I've cracked it. And then you'll go through a week of, I can't say a thing. And it could be just your brain's processing certain things. It could be there could be many reasons why that happens. But just so you know, it's normal. It happens to me too. And it's part of the kind of the growing pains of learning. And you will get there. You will definitely get there. Just takes more and more exposure, more and more time, and practice, and that's it. So I see that there are a number of questions, so I'm going to go through and see if I can answer the questions that I've got here. Has that changed over time? Were you harder on yourself with your first few languages? Ethan, Yeah, I mean, I've definitely matured as I've got older, and I don't take myself so seriously, I think, anymore. Yeah, I mean, I think possibly, before I'd finished my university degree and I'd done other courses at universities where, you get confirmation. Like some of you wrote to me and said, I've sat the C1 exam, so I know that I'm fluent, but even so, it feels a bit weird sometimes. I get that. I really get that. But yeah, I think after I'd done all of those things and I've been working in a number of languages for many, many years, I kind of don't really need that feedback on whether or not I speak a language so much as I did before. So I'm aware that sometimes I'll speak and I'll just go, oh, and it will just be nonsense. But I know that that's because of other reasons and not necessarily because of my knowledge of a language. And so I don't, it has definitely, I've mellowed a lot with age and sort of with experience and practice. And so this is why I hope that sharing this is helpful to you. And I will keep sharing my daily thoughts as well, so that I can sort of share in little bits of these things as I think about them. Bok Richard, puno pozdrava iz Hrvatske. Hvala ti puno. Hvala, pozdrav iz Makedonije. Bonjour de Québec, Montréal. Je suis depuis longtemps. Je suis de semblant crise de tabarnak. Dites, c'est le meilleur. Continue à écrire. Tu te fais de bon boulot. Ah, merci bien. C'est très gentil. Je l'apprécie. Merci. Ahoj, Praze. Z Prahy, šapo. Okay. Chápu, že lidé nechtějí vprost angličtinu, a tak se snažím mluvit anglicky, když pokají někoho z Anglie. Ano, no ale to je normálně. Myslím, že to bylo také i v Čechách, když jsem tam bydlel. Ale hele, potřebuju také mluvit česky tam, takže to nebylo strašně velký problém pro mě v Čechách, ale já si myslím, že to je normální. To je normální. Hello, Richard. Thank you again for your live streaming. I personally feel like there's a topical fluency. Yeah, absolutely. Topical fluency is good. Where you're fluent on a particular subject or small talk, but not fluent in other areas. Lucas, you're absolutely right. There is topical fluency. So you could be fluent on certain topics. Like, for example, you may have done a lot about the weather. You may like to talk about the weather. You may like to talk about your hobbies. You may like to talk about certain things that you know that you can speak about very well. This doesn't stop actually ever. So this continues all the way through, even in your first language. So you'll find people who, well, they may never be fluent in any language on, sort of terms around the economy or politics or science or philosophy, or there are many topics, areas of interest that people might not be able to converse on in any language. So it's the same when you learn a language. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Experience that people react happily when I greet to order and say goodbyes. Yeah, they do. When you say nice things like that, people tend to be quite nice. I very much agree on the correctly. Exact translation, sometimes it's hard. And if the grammar of the languages doesn't add up, for example, with cases of pronouns, absolutely, Lucas, absolutely. So sometimes, yeah, you can't quite get the exact translation because of grammar as well. Sometimes the grammar does things in certain languages that you can't do in another language. That's absolutely true. Richard, I haven't commented on your live streams in a while. I really hope you're well and everything is fine your way. Thank you. Thank you very much, Douglas. I appreciate it. Po tvém myšleniu, koliku jsou makedonský jazyky, bulgarský jazyk sličné? No, rozumím, no, to je... no. To je... makedonska gramatika je slična, to je normalna, mislim, ale no, rozumíme se bez probléma, ale to nije jako svaki jazyk imamo puno reča che su da slične. No, a tako je. To nije za mene problem da razumijem kad govore u Bugarskoj. Ali kad govorim u grupi, na primjer, tamo ili ovdje u Makedoniji, to je za njih, možda da je to problem, zato je to kad imamo, ne znam, neke šalu ili nešto tako, da govorimo nešto smiješke na naškom jeziku. To je za njih malo trudnije. Razumite dobro kad govorimo, ali i to je to ista stvar i u Bugarskoj kad govore o nešto, ne znam, to je moguće i nešto tako za nas nešto govorno kako od ulice, nešto tako, nije to isto. Ali generalno to moram kazati da je to za mene bez problema, razumijemo se, kad smo tamo i ovdje. I kad govorimo lično tako s nekim, to nije za nas problem. Razumjeti i komunicirati ideje tako, bez problema. I think that being fluent is when you'd rather express in one language rather than in your mother tongue, because that makes no sense to you. Absolutely. So yeah, if you, well, I'm not sure about that, actually, Daniel. I'm not sure. I kind of agree with you, but I'm not sure if I fully agree. So if you'd rather express yourself in one language than in your mother tongue because that makes more sense to you, I don't know. I don't know about that, because sometimes it doesn't really make any difference. You can just speak whichever. So sometimes for me, for example, it's if someone speaks to me in English or Macedonian, or it doesn't really make a big difference. I was just speaking now and speaking in our language, Croatian, Serbian, and I found that because I'd just been speaking Czech before, in the beginning when I was reading it, I was like, wow, why? Especially because Croatian's written in the Latin script, so I was reading it as sort of, and it's quite similar, so I'm finding that a little bit hard to make the switch over. I don't have to do that very often, but generally it's I don't know if I feel so much that way. Maybe it depends on the language as well. Some languages, of course, I mean, like if I were to speak Greek, I can speak Greek to a certain point, but absolutely, I mean, if it were to get to more complex topics, I would possibly be able to learn about them and talk about them a little bit, but I would feel more comfortable in one of my home languages for sure, or something like that. But I don't know. I don't know. In terms of fluency generally, you can just be happy to speak whichever. Do you find that your mistakes in language help you to better remember certain vocabulary in the future? Once you have caught the mistakes and someone calls them out? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, mistakes really help me to remember things. Absolutely. I passed the highest level of Korean proficiency exam and still have days where I don't feel fluent. Yeah, well, I can understand that, absolutely. There are some words that to learn that are so different. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes, I mean, there are always going to be things that you don't know. I have conversations sometimes with people who speak just the one language, and there may be things that you know that they don't know. As somebody who's learned the language, it's interesting when you have those conversations. So yeah, sometimes you have a very different perspective on it as well, and they don't normally have. Anem um, some tips and tricks of fluency in language. The tips and tricks of fluency in language, I think, is just practicing a lot, particularly things that you're going to likely talk about. In the very beginning, it's mainly about your situation and talking about sort of people close to you. So if you can express yourself quite freely and automatically on those topics, then you're going to set yourself up quite well to be able to move forward and then advance into other spheres of interest, and then you sort of keep building up these different areas. I think that's kind of the way I go about it normally, and yeah, that's kind of really how it's done. But I make it sound very easy, and I've just said it in a few sentences, but yeah, of course, it takes time and practice. Let me see. With reading fluency, I sometimes should know how I've actually learned. I can read books in Latin, but I sometimes wonder whether I'm just relying on a few things I've learned and a lot of loanwords. Sometimes we are, Michael. Sometimes we do rely on loanwords. We rely on things we already know. And I kind of say no harm, no foul. If you know that, then it's not the end of the world. But it's kind of being aware that sometimes it could be an issue. But generally, I think it's fine to be able to leverage the knowledge that you have from other languages is perfectly fine. It's just sort of keeping that balance between leveraging knowledge and this other language being more like a veneer on that language. And so you therefore only ever speak this language, but with a kind of a very brittle and fragile veneer of the other language you're attempting to speak. FSI provides class hour estimates. To go classes for Turkish. To learn English speakers would be multiple. Yeah. So there are actually for the CFR levels as well, they tend to, at the different language schools, tell you what they expect you to do to be able to get to a certain level. So for Turkish, for example, for A1 level, you're expected to have 72 contact hours with your teacher, and then you're supposed to study around 20 hours. If you're doing it intensively, 20 hours a week over a 3-month period, that I did for Turkish. That was for A1, the same for A2, and then for B1, it was double that. That's kind of how it worked for Turkish. Different languages may be different. It depends on your starting point and where you're going. Okay, I find that I have opportunity to rely on resources learning. An example would be when chatting online, relying on a translator, even when I know I understand what. Yeah. Yeah, sometimes we can rely quite heavily on technology, particularly. So just to maybe check something or whatever else, but it can make us a little bit dependent. Which is why I think conversation is really good, because you kind of can't do any. You can't really do anything in a conversation. You have to just talk, right? And if you don't know it, you don't know. You have to actually ask. I'm sort of, when I was at university, we didn't really have the internet as we have today, so it wasn't possible to. It wasn't really possible to check anything. You just had to speak. If you didn't speak it, you didn't speak it. If you didn't know something, you didn't know it. So you had to really learn. Okay. Tried to learn English for 2 years. Spanish is my mother tongue. Even lived in Canada and worked as a customer service representative. Okay, I don't feel confident or fluent when I speak with another English speaker. Yeah, that's quite common as well. So sometimes we will actually feel more confident speaking with other people who have learned the language, and I've heard that a lot too. And it's because they have the same kind of empathy, and they may use similar types of words and stuff. Whereas what happens with speakers of the language who particularly sort of traditionally monolingual speakers who may learn other languages later, but is that they have their own idiolects as well. So it's not just about dialects, it's about idiolects too. So they'll have certain words that they like the sound of in their family, and they just use them all the time. So those kinds of things can really impact. Whereas when people learn languages as a second language, there tend to be sort of a type of vocabulary that you come across during those courses. And I think so sometimes that happens. Also, accents can vary quite wildly with speakers, particularly English speakers. Absolutely. I get that completely. Sometimes when I speak to different people from different, or I hear family speaking in other languages that I know, and I'm like, wow, they used that in that way. That's really interesting. Wow, we would never say that at home. I mean, there are certainly words that we use in the Macedonian I speak, that I wouldn't use in Skopje, for example, or in other cities because they wouldn't understand them. Yeah, it's the way it is. But yeah, that's what happens with native speakers, for sure. I get that, but it's worth just trying to get over it and actually speak more with them so that you get that experience and exposure. It doesn't have anything to do with the title, but I've always wanted to ask. Okay, Philip, let me see. Did I answer your question, Philip? Dearie me, I think I may have missed your question if I did. I'm sorry, please write it again if I have. What do you think about sentence mining? Rasmus, actually, I mean, Speakly that I've been using for Estonian, it's a bit like sentence mining, the way they teach Estonian. They're quite realistic sentences that I can imagine myself using. I don't tend to do it typically myself. When I'm doing it, it might just be a sort of a happy coincidence of learning sometimes that I'll read sentences or see sentences or come across sentences that can be adjusted and adapted for whatever I want. I just sort of swap words in and out, and but otherwise I don't typically do it. I do see value in doing it. I mean, I get why people do it deliberately, but yeah, it's a bit like that with Speakly, and it's worked quite well actually. Has it happened to you that you learn a new word, expression in language and can't help but sort of cross-check it with another language you speak? Okay, and it ends up overwhelming you because it's virtually impossible to uniformly lift your vocabulary up in every language. I hope you understand what I'm getting at. Yeah, so you learn a word and you try and learn it in all the languages, or if it's a word that is similar. So sometimes, right, for example, so some words I don't aim to learn. So today, for example, my mother-in-law used a word that I very rarely hear anybody here use. The word was yabancı, and it's from the Turkish word yabancı, which means foreigner. And it was used in the context of someone from outside the area or family unit, not necessarily someone from another country. And it's pronounced yabancı and not yabancı, because there is a change of Turkish words to make them Macedonian here. And so sometimes words come up like that I've learnt in one language and not in another. So I definitely knew the word yabancı in Turkish before I knew it in Macedonian, for example. And there are other words like that. Like I knew the word sokak in actually I knew it in Arabic first, then I learnt it in Turkish, and then I learnt it actually exists in Macedonian too. Um, so there are a number of words like that I've done, but I haven't necessarily looked for them before I've come across them, if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. But it's quite interesting actually when you come across those kinds of things. Nothing beats live conversation. You cannot, yeah, you can't cheat. No, there's no cheating. No, Ivo, yeah, we spoke in Estonian, so you heard me using my Estonian. You were very patient with me. Thank you very much for that. And yeah, it was really, really nice to actually use it. But yeah, you can't. You have to use what you know, and if you don't know, you don't know it. What draws you to new languages nowadays? Do you find yourself learning them out of necessity, such as work or travel, or is it more spontaneous than that? Also, is fluency always an initial aim? Really good question, Ethan. So I don't particularly need to learn any more languages for my work anymore. I think those days are fairly, yeah, fairly much numbered, really. To be honest, learning new, like to start a new career, for example, I don't imagine that I would need to particularly. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. You never know, but not typically. So what tends to happen is for a trip, I will learn a language to not to maybe to a very high level anymore, because I've been through the whole going to university and doing my degree and living through languages and working through languages and living in different countries, and I've kind of been there, done that, got the t-shirt on all of those things, and so I don't feel a deep need to necessarily have this amazing level of fluency as my end goal. And I'm very happy with that being sort of a very distant goal for me. And it's definitely been the case for languages like Greek, where I'm like, okay, well, I know enough Greek to go to Greece, to talk to the people in Greek. They speak back to me in Greek. I understand what they're saying generally, and I can communicate what my needs and have a conversation with people, and it tends to work. So there are languages like that slowly but surely I'm building up my Greek more and more, but I've not felt the need to sort of have a huge fluency drive for them. Similar thing with Albanian, similar thing with Turkish. I can quite adequately get around and do what I need to do in those languages. Don't feel I need to be amazing at them. Similar thing with some of the other Slavic languages too. My Czech's probably gone down from where it was. It was quite good at one point. It's probably down a lot more now, but I don't feel the need. I can understand it well enough, and I can communicate. Similar thing with Polish. Similar thing actually with Serbian, Croatian are a bit weird because in terms of understanding, I understand them very well because we send a lot of jokes, or the memes and the videos and the funny jokes that you send to each other here tend to be in those languages, and so we have a lot of that kind of stuff. And then TV and radio and songs and stuff tend to be in those languages too. So it's kind of, I understand them very well, but then actively speaking them, I don't tend to speak them very often. But if I do, I can kind of get back into it if I just sort of start listening to it and start giving it a go. But yeah, I don't tend to worry too much. Lately, I've been studying more Celtic languages. I want to get back to sort of learning minority, indigenous, endangered, and vulnerable languages. So quite a lot of focus on Celtic languages, and I've been obviously working on Korean very slowly, but Korean is one of those very slow burns for me. It's I'll get there eventually, hopefully. And if I don't, look, I don't. I mean, if I die before I learn Korean, it's not going to be the end of the world. But yeah, I mean, hopefully I'll achieve something with it at some point. But yeah, I've kind of got this vague sort of just keep it going and make it more normal for me to hear. Because in the beginning, I didn't really ever hear any Korean, so now it's sort of the sounds are a bit more normal for me to hear, and certainly seeing the words on the page are more normal for me now than they were. But I still can't speak it to any level of fluency. I would say that unfortunately I'm still not even A1 in Korean. No, but yeah, I still do that, and I'm still carrying on with my Estonian as well. And Estonian, yeah, I don't need for any particular reason, but I'm enjoying it. It's been fun. When a language focus on listening, yeah, it's good to have focuses that mean something to you. Absolutely. Which is my best language after English? That's a very good question. I don't know. I really don't know anymore. Sometimes I would have always just said French because French is the one that I spoke from a very young age, and I know quite a lot of French, but my Macedonian's pretty strong. I've been speaking it at home for 17 years, so it's a long time to speak a language at home and to have that as your main language. So it's quite a long time. But then also, I mean, you know, other home languages that I have, Spanish, German, and are also pretty good. And my Dutch was always very good. But yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to sort of say which is my, I mean, after English, it would definitely be Macedonian and or French, I guess. And then Spanish and German maybe as well, close. So yeah, they would be they're my top 5 languages because they're the ones I use most in terms of at home, right? What do you think about immersion-based approaches? If old advocates start speaking until perhaps B2-ish, not starting to speak until you're perhaps B2-ish, can't understand how that would be sensible or work, to be honest with you. B2 is a very high level in a language, and I don't know how you would not speak the language at all until you get to B2, and then you just start speaking at B2 level. I would wonder how that's possible. I'd wonder how that's possible. Hablar con fluidez cuando puedo entender completamente la radio en español. No si es posible. Claro que sí es posible. Claro que sí. Es posible. Hace falta tiempo, ¿eh? Pero vas a llegar. Do you have any advice on listening comprehension fluency? I've been studying Japanese for a little over a year and I still find it challenging. It is quite literally, you have to keep listening to it a lot. That's what I found. And it's weird because one day, I remember days when a language, I'd just hear it on the radio and I wouldn't even need to focus on it. It would just be on the background and I could even have a conversation with somebody else and I'd hear something from the radio and react to it. And that's a really cool feeling when you have that in a language, that you're not even focusing on what you're hearing. It takes a lot of immersion, a lot of listening to get to that level where you do it. But yeah, it's possible. It is challenging though. Absolutely challenging, yeah, of course. It just takes time and patience. Sorry. I wish I could tell you there's a magic pill. There just isn't. There isn't. I know a lot of people do sort of want you to say that there's a magic way of doing things and you can learn, and if you just do this or if you just do that. Unfortunately, it's just not the way it works. It just takes time. It's not what people want to hear, and it's not the kind of the sexy way of selling languages or courses or anything, but it just takes time. It really does. I mean, I don't learn any language to like a hugely amazing level within months or something. It's just not what happens. It just isn't what happens. I've never really met anyone that can. And I've met a lot of language learners. I mean, I'm not going to say that I know more than anyone else about this. I definitely don't. But I have met a lot of language learners, and I've still never met anybody who really does speak a language. I've met people who think they speak languages really well, and then they don't know certain things that. Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't know. I think it takes time. Everything takes time. Any advice to improve your spoken fluency aside from interacting with natives? Spoken fluency, well, I mean, don't need to be native. Native is a weird thing, I think. I'm much more of a kind of native level, first language level kind of person. So if you're practicing your language with people who speak the language well, then it's the same difference, really. Oh dear, excuse me. Okay, let's see. Mostly speaking, can it? Okay. See if I can answer any more questions. And then I have to disappear, unfortunately. Do you feel weird or intimidated when people ask you the reason why you are learning a certain language? Some people just love languages and may not need a reason for work or because of a boyfriend. Yeah, Svetlana, people do ask why I learn a language, and they ask all the time. For me, if I'm happy with the reason that I'm learning a language, then that's all that matters. What somebody else's opinion of why I'm learning it doesn't matter so much. So usually people ask me because they're kind of just curious, so I just answer and give them a regular sort of, I actually just like languages. And I mean, then let's be honest. I mean, some of the languages that I've been studying, over my life, some of them make more sense or less sense to other people because they're just more or less studied by other people they know. So I get it. I mean, I get why it can seem weird sometimes, but at the same time, I mean, look, I mean, I don't go around saying to people, well, why do you take photographs, or why do you sing, or why do you play an instrument? Or if it was quite clear, you do it because you want to and because you're interested in it and because that's what drives you, it's what motivates you, that's what you're passionate about. And same thing really, isn't it, with languages? I mean, what it comes down to is I'm just passionate about words and communicating with other people and finding out about other people and where they're from and what they do and how they think and learning about their history and learning about their perspectives. I just really, really like all of that, and I like the feeling it gives me to be able to express myself using another grammar and vocabulary, and that for me is really what it's all about. There's nothing more to it than that, and it doesn't really make any difference to me, sort of the number of speakers or why, but I tend to learn languages because I love languages, and whichever language that is, there's always a good reason, right? If you're learning it, I mean, if you're learning it, why not? Sometimes some of the reasons might sound weird to some people, but as long as they make sense to you, who cares, right? Can't please it. This is the thing, right? In life generally, you can't please everybody all of the time. And if you try to please everybody all of the time, you end up pleasing no one. So, because it annoys people, so it's best just to, like, as long as you please yourself and you're happy with what you're doing, and you're comfortable in your own skin, and you know that what you're doing is something that means something to you. That for me is the really the important thing. I've absolutely do not do this for anybody else's benefit except for my own. Sometimes I do it because I want to support a community and I fall in love with the community and I want to support the community and I want voices to be heard. And so sometimes I might do that because I'm fortunate to have that kind of platform in a language area where sometimes I will be asked to talk about certain things on TV or in a newspaper or on a radio show. And I'm fortunate to be able to do that. And I really, really value those opportunities. And then also with the Polyglot Conference, I get to raise, give voices, or give a stage to people who are very capable and often more capable than I am to talk about certain things. And I get to learn about things like that myself. And if I get into it, it might show other people that it's possible. So sometimes it's not just me being selfish. Sometimes there is a little bit of that in it, but mostly it's me just wanting to do it because I want to do it. And I'm not going to pretend it's not. It is. It's because I just like learning about other people and other cultures and other societies, and then when it comes up in conversation, sometimes I can sort of talk about it, and I get to, whether it's in the language or not, I can talk about that experience, and that for me has been absolutely invaluable. I've loved it, and I've loved the connections that I've been able to make over the years, whether they're linguistic connections or cultural connections or whatever. I mean, particularly with indigenous and the indigenous languages theme for me has been a real journey of identity and culture and history, and it's been actually more than studying the actual languages. That's been really important to me. But I love studying languages too, of course. But there's a lot that I've got out of this, personally, as well as conversations I've had with other people. There we go. So slightly long answer to that question. I'm sorry, but yeah, there we go. Let me see if you're native is weird. Yeah, it's a weird native is a weird thing. In fact, I mean, in the UK, we don't use the word native. Like, you can't look for a native speaker of something because it's actually illegal. It's in the UK. You can't do that. It's a form of discrimination because there are people who speak, say, English. Let's take English because it's the most widely spoken language in the UK. There are people who speak English to a native level or a first language level, but they may not describe that English as their native language. They may have another language that they speak at home. So therefore, we say native level or first language level or whatever, or fluent or whatever, but not native on its own, if that makes sense. So there is a distinction there. And it's an important one because if people say, well, I'm not native English, I didn't speak English at home, but they actually could speak English way better than somebody who spoke just English at home and be able to write it better, for example, because they concentrated more in class. Who knows? I would never make that kind of distinction for that reason, as well. So yes. I'm sorry it's already been asked. I'm a bit late to the party, but how do you feel about language exam certificates? Oh, I actually quite enjoy sitting exams. I like them. I'm a bit weird in that way. I did my grade 1 Cornish exam this year and passed, which I was very happy about. I had not done exams for a while since then, until then. But I've done the Turkish exams, A1, A2, and B1. I went to university and studied languages. I studied an advanced diploma in Czech studies at Charles University. What else have I done? I've been to a number of university courses in other countries, particularly Scandinavia, Sweden, and also Iceland, where I studied and got certificates and sat exams and different things. So I've done that quite a lot, and I actually really like the challenge of an exam. The thing I like about exams and certificates is it normally forces you out of your sort of your comfort zone, because what can happen when you learn a language is you can focus on things that are really easy for you, and you can just keep repeating those over and over again, and it becomes so easy and automatic that it's almost not a challenge anymore, and you can almost feel as though that you're more fluent than you potentially are as well. That can be another issue if you're only using it in a very small context. Whereas if you do a language exam, sometimes that can just take you out of that, because they'll ask you to talk about things that you wouldn't normally talk about. So I quite like that challenge. I find that really good. So yeah, I do like them. It's not the most popular opinion, I know, but I like them. Do you ever get tired of studying? If so, do you have a break, or do you soldier on no matter what? Sometimes I have a break, yeah. Sometimes I agree with myself that I'm going to have a break sometimes, and I have a break. But I do enjoy studying. I like learning. I like the whole thrill of learning more stuff and learning more languages. But I've had, when my daughter was born, I had a 3-year break from studying languages. 3-year break. When she was at home and she wasn't going to kindergarten or anything like that, I took 3 years, and I spent 3 years with her at home and helped with her own development. So I wanted to be a hands-on dad. For me, it was really important to be part of my daughter's life in the very formative years, and to be an important part of that, and to help her with her own development. So I was at home for 3 years, and I didn't study languages. The final year, I did start going once a week to a BSL course, British Sign Language course, but that was it. I just went once a week. But otherwise, and that was she was already asleep at that time. It was in the evening. But otherwise, no, I didn't study languages for those years. And that's actually when I released the video, the very first video I made on YouTube, speaking in 16 of the languages I'd studied at that point. So yeah, that was after kind of a break of studying languages when I made that video as well. It's quite crazy to do that, but yeah, I did. That's what I did. Thank you very much for being so kind, Logical Lord. I appreciate your kind words. Thank you. Okay, let me see. Oh my word. Wow, there are so many more. On Instagram, I'm not seeing many of the questions, but I think it's because it might be mixed up in all of that chatter. I get a lot of notifications. If you have an Instagram question, do feel free to pop it in the questions box. Oh, JR, streamed on your birthday. Happy birthday. I hope you have a lovely day. I'm a big birthdays fan, so I'm very happy that I'm able to say happy birthday to you. I like wishing people happy birthday. It's one of those things, I think that it's one of those days where it's quite nice to be able to sort of say something nice to somebody and send a message. It's one of those days where I find I can reach out to Facebook friends and sort of say hello and touch base with them. And I quite enjoy that. So happy birthday. Hope you have a very nice day. And I'm sure you will get fluent in your Chinese and Japanese. Okay. It was harder to be fluent in Chinese and Japanese. Do I feel it was harder to become fluent in Chinese and Japanese compared to like German or Dutch? Oh, for me, so my Chinese and Japanese are definitely nowhere near fluent. So Chinese, I got to a point where I could communicate a lot of stuff. Probably like an early B1-ish level I got to in Chinese. No further than that, for sure. And Japanese, I probably got to maybe an A1 level max. That was it. So not very far. Japanese I studied because I wanted to know how the kanji worked. Because I could ask people, but it didn't really make sense until I'd learned it myself. So I didn't really learn Japanese to speak it properly, just to be able to say basic things. But there's no doubt in my mind that it was easier for me to learn German and Dutch. Absolutely. Because they're more related to English. And also, when I learned German, I already spoke Swedish. And when I learned Dutch, I already spoke German and Swedish. And so it was a lot easier. And I also spoke French, which helped as well. Every time I tell people that I am learning Spanish, they tell me, do you want to make Spanish girlfriend? Anyway, Spanish girlfriend. Well, could be a reason, I suppose, to learn a language, to find a partner and and speak. But yeah, it's only one reason, right? Let's see. Congrats on Cornish. I love Tess too. Oh, I'm glad you like Tess as well, E. It's just sometimes it gets sort of distinction. Okay. Distinction between language and its actual used. Yeah, sometimes it can be. So with an exam, it can be theoretical in places. But I think also that theory, you can aim to use it more in your normal conversation. If you try and take the conversations into different directions and manipulate them. I like to try and do that from time to time. But yeah, very often, for example, I mean, this is why they say, the core vocabulary that we use in day-to-day life is actually quite limited. We don't tend to use that many words because we don't talk about that many things with everybody that we come across. We don't talk to everyone about everything, right, all of the time. So, I mean, things that people talk about, for example, particularly lately, I mean, my medical vocabulary in Macedonian is pretty good because I know a lot of those terms, and so I can talk quite confidently about medical things and stuff, particularly at the moment with all of what's going on in the world. But yeah, I mean, you're not talking about that with everyone, right, in every language. So which is when you have many languages in your head, do you not mix them up when you speak or delay your speech choosing the right word? Okay. And French. Okay, so good question, Christopher. So generally, I don't think in a language. I think in thoughts and feelings and images and emotions. I don't think in a language. It just comes out. So if I read that in English, it comes out in English. Typically, I can move from language to language quite easily. Some languages I find a little bit more challenging, particularly like I just had a bit of like maybe a minute or so where I was struggling going from Czech to Croatian, but that's really it. It's not a huge issue. It just needs to get back into my stride. I think that's quite normal. Other languages, I'd have zero problems. So I can just go between them very easily, particularly my home languages. I mean, I could start a sentence in one, end it in another, and go however I want. Zero problem at all. But some languages, yeah, of course, it can be a little bit more difficult. Some of them I might mix as well. Every now and again, you mix something. You may just have a random thought in a language, and it gets mixed. But generally speaking, I'm quite good at separating them, and I'm quite good at keeping, moving from one to another. So I used to work in a lot of different languages for my job, so I had to go from one to the other very quickly. So I got a lot of practice doing that, and so that's probably why. But I would definitely say that it's I would definitely say that it takes practice, and it's maybe a different type of skill even sometimes. So I would, it's speaking a language and speaking lots of languages is one thing, and then speaking them at the same time and moving very quickly, this sort of changing from language to languages is a different thing. And also translating is a different skill as well, and interpreting is another skill again. These are all different skills. So somebody can be good at one or more of those things and still learn lots of languages. Does that make sense? I hope so. Do you plan to do Nesagrav, Cernowic? I do. I am actually starting my second grade in Cornish, and I plan to just continue with it. I love Cornish. I think it's brilliant. I have conversation groups, and I love the community. I think that Cornish speakers are very welcoming, and I found it very, very easy to plug into that community. And anyone who wants to join and learn Cornish, I absolutely would love to see you in the Cornish groups, and hopefully in Cornwall when we can travel again as well. I would love to go to Cornwall myself. I don't think I've actually been to Cornwall, which is crazy, but yeah, I would love to go. And yeah, so yeah, second grade is starting in 2 weeks officially. But I've been speaking Cornish all through the summer as well. I have conversation groups that I go to speak Cornish, and my Cornish isn't amazing, but I can sort of talk about things, basic things. But yeah, second grade, here I come, and then there's third grade, and then there's fourth grade, and that's it. So there are 4 grades of Cornish. I consider my mum to be fluent in English because she can have conversations with adults, but she can't understand TV shows and movies sometimes in English because it's not her native language. Yeah, that can happen too, Joe. Absolutely. Would I still consider her fluent in English? Yeah, why not? I mean, just because you can't understand every single film or TV show, I mean, there are people from the United States that could watch things in the United Kingdom and not understand them. I mean, I went to university with a guy from the Bahamas, and he came into my room, and I was watching something in Scots. And okay, Scots isn't English, so it's probably a bad. But he didn't even recognize. He couldn't understand anything at all. And it's the closest language to English. But maybe that's it. Yeah, maybe that's a bad example. But sometimes even with like certain dialects, like my own home dialect of Scouse, people don't always understand when we speak in dialect, so that can also be difficult. But yeah, it's weird. But yeah, I think you can be fluent without understanding every single thing. Fluency doesn't necessarily mean that you understand everything that's meant for a certain society as well, right? So if your mum can interact with everybody and get through life and do her job and whatever else, there's definitely an argument to say that she's fluent in the language. She doesn't have to understand every single thing. Some monolinguals don't understand every single thing in English. So you're off to Penzance this October. Oh, I hope that you have a good time. Might be with someone overlucky who speaks. That would be fantastic. I would love to go. Wow. My law professor needed subtitles to understand British TV shows like Derry Girls. Yeah, Derry Girls. Derry Girls is a good example. So that is Irish English. That's not Ulster Scots. That is Irish English, and yeah, exactly. Like you say, you wouldn't potentially be able to understand Derry Girls just if you speak English. But is your law professor still fluent in English? I'm guessing so. Right. So there we go. Okay. Well, I'm actually learning. I've just seen something in Irish here. I'm actually learning Irish right now. Unfortunately, I can't say very much yet, but hopefully I will get there. Dithar. I've got, oh wow, some cool things in Cornish here on Instagram. I've just seen. Fatal Guinness have you? Yeah, in Point Damaras. Fatal Guinness. So frustrated. Okay, huge. Do you speak two dialects of French? Yeah, so I studied Quebecois when I went to Canada. I went to spend a month in Canada, and so I went to study in Canada, and I went to spend a month in Canada. So I studied Quebecois to go there. But yeah, I kind of speak it, but not very well. But yeah, I did actually make a proper effort to learn it instead of like just putting on an accent. It took time. Okay. Do you think with a B1 German you could live in Germany? Yeah, you could definitely do a lot. I mean, there are going to be things that you'll miss, but with a B1 you can make a good start. Absolutely. And language, Derry Girls is Irish. Yeah, it's Irish. It's not Irish though. It's not Irish like the Celtic language Irish. It's Irish English is the language, right? Unless I'm thinking of something completely different. What do I think of the Baltic languages? I think they're brilliant. I like the Baltic languages. I studied Latvian. I don't know Lithuanian, but I studied Latvian. I would like to learn Lithuanian at some point. I'd like to study it at least. I don't understand Alex Ferguson. Okay, that's funny. Ok, ahorita estoy aprendiendo inglés y me gusta mucho a tu video. Muchas gracias, Camila. Le agradezco mucho. Suerte con tu inglés. Mucha suerte. How did you choose which dialect of Arabic to study? I haven't studied any dialects of Arabic. I only studied MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, Fusha. That's all I've studied in Arabic. And I've studied some Maltese, but that's not Arabic. And it's not considered a dialect of Arabic. Well, not since like hundreds of years ago anyway. Okay, I think I should really go. I got somebody to got cross with me because I went over an hour. I went over an hour, and now I'm like at 1 hour, 23 minutes. So I will stop here. Thank you all so much for your questions and for sticking with me and for joining me today. As ever, I absolutely loved talking about languages with you, and I look forward to talking to you next week. If you've got any ideas of topics you want to talk about particularly, please do let me know, and I'll be happy to sort of put things together and to answer the questions that you have. Really enjoyed it. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world. See you soon. Bye-bye. Happy learning.